Welcome back to this course on carbon footprint calculator. As we are discussing about the carbon footprint calculator, while designing a carbon footprint calculator, it is important for us to know the flow of the carbon footprint calculator. If that is clear to us, then designing a carbon footprint calculator would be pretty easy for us. So, what is expected is in the carbon footprint calculator, a user is required to fill in a questionnaire about the activities which the user do, and the calculator gives us an estimate of the carbon emissions, or what is known as the carbon footprint, based on the answers which the user gives. And that this way the carbon footprint calculator helps us to track and monitor the carbon footprint of the user. And one can also provide a provision of giving advice to the user as to what could be the ways of offsetting the carbon footprint of that user, and help him make more sustainable choices. Now, how does this carbon footprint calculator operate? So, what is the steps? What are the steps of this carbon footprint calculator? So, the steps involved in calculating the carbon footprint is as follows. First is we need to identify the scope of the carbon footprint calculation. And as I said, the carbon footprint calculator could be designed for an organization, or it could be product based also, or event based also. So the scope has to be defined before we go in for the design of a carbon footprint calculator. Then, in order to calculate the carbon footprint, one has to gather the data on the energy consumption, and one has to gather the data on the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the scope of the carbon footprint. It means that if we want to calculate, if the calculator has to calculate the organizational carbon footprint, then what is the input required for that calculator in order to arrive at the organizational carbon footprint? It would be the data which is going in the form of energy consumption of that organization, as also at the places wherever the greenhouse gas emissions are emitted, okay, when the product of that organization is coming to the marketplace. Then the emissions are to be emissions are to be calculated based on the sources like electricity, heating, transportation. So all these are to be arrived at, and then respective emission factors are to be taken into account. Then one can calculate the carbon footprint calculator. So this is how the carbon footprint calculator arrives at the carbon footprint, by considering the emission factors. Not only the emission factors of electricity, heating, and mobility are to be accounted for, but even the emissions from non-energy sources like materials like food we consume, okay, or the waste which is generated, that also needs to be accounted for, and then this accounting has to be done by again considering the specific emission factors. Once you figure it out, the emissions from the energy sources as well as non-energy sources from an organization, or for a product, or for an event, then what is to be done is we need to calculate the total carbon footprint by summing up all the emissions. So the carbon calculator would then sum up the emissions from all such sources and arrive at the total carbon footprint. Once it is done, the job of the carbon footprint calculator is actually done. But one can design the carbon footprint calculator to offer much more things. Like for example, the carbon footprint calculator could be employed even to analyze the results, and even to identify the areas of improvement, so that the user can not only quantify his or her carbon footprint, but also reduce the carbon footprint. So this could be an additional provision in the carbon footprint calculator, where the results are analyzed, and the areas wherein the carbon footprint could be reduced for that organization could be suggested. For example, if the organization is using more energy intensive equipments like air conditioners, then maybe some suggestions could be given as so as to reduce the energy consumption of the ACs which are employed in that organization. Okay. Or if the people are traveling by car, maybe some suggestions like carpooling could be given, or by calculations it could be shown that how much carbon footprint could be reduced by pulling the resources together like cars, or by employing some alternative means of transportation like electric vehicles and so on. Okay, so such areas could be generated by the carbon footprint calculator, and the ways of reducing the carbon footprint could also be seen in the carbon footprint calculator. Once this is done, then finally the task of the carbon footprint calculator is done, but then the implementation part starts. Okay. Uh, After implementation, again one can come back with the results and give the input to the carbon footprint calculator, and then the carbon footprint calculator can monitor the progress of reduction in the carbon footprint over a period of time. Okay, or it could compare the scenarios before implementing the measures, and after implementing the measures. And once it is done, then the results could be shared with the stakeholders like employees, customers, investors, and the organization's commitment to sustainability could be displayed, okay, demonstrated. So this is how the carbon footprint calculator has to be designed. This is the flow expected from a carbon footprint calculator.